On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the presidents of Russia, Iran, and Turkey will discuss the Syrian crisis. Can these unlikely partners cooperate over Assad's campaign to reunite his country? And to mark the 5th anniversary of China's Belt and Road Initiative, special guests from around the world about how this global initiative contributes to reshaping their prospects.
The increase of the Chinese role in international cooperation is a very important tool.
We can help the coordination of policies between the various members of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you from Beijing on CGTN. The presidents of Iran, Russia, and Turkey are in Tehran for a summit on Friday. The meeting came as Damascus and its main backer, Moscow, have vowed to root out the jihadist groups that dominate Idlib province, the last major rebel stronghold in Syria. On Tuesday, despite warnings from the U.S. and the UN, Russia relaunched the airstrikes against Idlib. Russia and Turkey and Iran are the guarantors of the Astana process, a track of negotiations that has eclipsed the older Geneva process. This effectively helps Syrian President Assad assert his authority over the country. In parallel to the Syrian government's military buildup, the recent weeks have seen intense diplomatic activity.
There have been many dark days for Syria, but the Battle of Idlib could bring the bloodiest of them all. Russia and the Syrian government are preparing to flush out thousands of what they say are terrorists. But more than 1 million children are trapped, and the US has warned it will not tolerate wholesale slaughter.
I just tell you that they will hopefully be very, very judicious and careful, because the world is watching. That cannot be a slaughter. If it's a slaughter, the world is going to get very, very angry. And the United States is going to get very angry too.
But Russia has brushed aside US warnings of airstrikes and says the problem of Idlib must be solved. In last-minute talks, Russia, Iran and Turkey will try to find a humanitarian solution that would see families move into Syrian government control. The fear is that many will not trust President Bashar al-Assad's assurances and will stay put. But Russian analysts say it is the US that is jeopardizing the peace.
Why doesn't the US like our peace talks? Russia, Turkey and Iran took responsibility to arrange the Syrian conflict settlement without US participation. The US doesn't like that Turkey, a NATO country, is leaning towards Russia and Iran. So the Americans are trying to undermine our peace settlement at any cost.
Iran says it will continue to back the Syrian government, and yet Turkey fears a massacre may happen. Once again, there are 5 governments wrangling over what should happen next, and 3 million people whose fate depends on it.
For more, in Beijing, we have Ms. He Wenping, professor at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and in Tehran, Mohammad Marandi, professor and dean of World Faculty Studies at the University of Tehran. Joining us in Washington, D.C., Aykan Admir, former member of the Turkish Parliament. Last but not least, in Moscow, Mark Slobodka, international relations and security analyst. Gentlemen and lady here in China, welcome to our program. Let me start by asking the other 3 gentlemen first. Will these 3 parties, unlikely to be partners, but now it is, Turkey, Russia and Iran, be able to work together on the issue of Syria? How confident really, Professor Marandi, you are about that?
I think the 3 countries actually do have very good relations with each other. I do think that they are quite sincere in their relationships with one another. Iran and Russia, especially over the past few years, gradually after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but especially over the past few years, and especially with regards to Syria, they've moved a lot closer to each other. They have very similar interests in very key areas. both are antagonized by the United States and are under a great deal of pressure from Washington. And on the other hand, Iran has always had very strong historic ties with Turkey, especially during the last couple of decades. What really turned things a bit sour was Syria's, the issue of Syria and Iran and Turkey's differences between the two countries, the differences that existed between the two countries on Syria.
Right.
But I think that right now there is a strong sense of convergence between the three countries, especially, of course, between Iran and Russia that existed beforehand. And I think the positions of these two countries and Turkey are moving closer to each other.
About Turkey, Mr. Ademir, of course, recently Turkey and Washington are not necessarily on great terms if you look at the economic interactions. As a result of this and many other issues recently pop up between the two countries, how determined will Turkey be, in a way, to be a partner in this triangle relationship with Russia and also with Iran about Syria?
Turkey's relationship has been and will remain compartmentalized when it comes to relations with Russia and Iran. There are recent convergences, in part stemming from the growing diplomatic spat between Turkey and US. But at the same time, there are also divergences, as we have seen in Syria. We have also seen that earlier in Iraq. Iran and Turkey have different plans for the Middle East. Sometimes these plans come on a crashing course, and sometimes they find a middle ground. So I think Turkey will continue to play all sides. There will be stormy relations with the US, which goes alongside some cooperation in security and military affairs. And when it comes to Syria, we will see continued coordination between Ankara, Moscow, and Tehran, while the big divergences still remain.
Right. The storm between Turkey and the United States, will that cement this partnership? What about for Russia? Is Russia ever more confident about its leading role, not only in this partnership, but also in the issue overall involving Syria, Mr. Sloboda?
Yeah, Russia and Iran are certainly on the same page when it comes to the situation in Syria and much else. They are countries that are a real strategic partner. When it comes to Russia and Iran on one hand, and the Erdogan regime in Turkey on the other, we need to be perfectly clear about the nature of the relationship regarding the situation in Syria and the Astana Agreement. They are cooperating with each other and they are doing diplomacy, not because they are friends or partners, but because they are enemies. The Turkish regime has been instrumental since the beginning of this conflict in waging the proxy war of Islamists and jihadists on Syria. Turkey is where the majority of them were armed, trained, and salaried by US, Gulf states, and otherwise. By cooperating with Turkey in an attempt to play to its interest with regards to the Kurds and the conflict with the US there, Russia hoped to cut all of the other supporters of the jihadists in Syria out of the conflict. The US, the EU, the Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others. That has succeeded. But we should not have any illusions that they are friends. Turkey still has designs on occupying the Drablus corridor and would like to continue to control Idlib as well.
Well, Mr. Ademir, there are enormous amounts of accusations coming from your Russian colleague. Your response?
Now, Turkey's policy vis-à-vis Syria has changed quite a bit. At the outset, the Turkish government had grand designs about Syria. It wanted to overthrow the regime by supporting jihadists. When that failed to materialize, Turkey looked for the long game in Syria. However, when the tide turned, Turkey's attitude toward jihadist elements began to sour. In fact, some of the jihadist elements started targeting Turkey itself. So more recently, We have seen Turkey turning against jihadist elements, although still some rebel forces continue to function as Turkish proxies paid by Ankara. And just last week, Turkey declared HTS as a terrorist organization, which comes quite late in the game. But it shows that Turkey, disappointed by the failure of its grand strategy for Syria, is now trying to make do, is now trying to find a way out. It's in damage control mode.
Damage control, but Professor Morandi, do you think there's much sincerity coming from Tehran? Coming from Turkey about that? Is it really damage control, or is it just another new strategy?
Well, I think there are a number of important events that have taken place, and you've alluded to them as well. One is the economic warfare being waged against Turkey by the United States. Of course, the United States is engaging in economic warfare against Iran and Russia as well. But I think for Turkey, this was a bit unexpected, the way in which Trump... that has changed a lot of the calculations in Ankara. On the other hand, as the previous guest rightly pointed out, the group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is basically Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda in Syria, it has just over the last few days been declared by Turkey as a terrorist organization. And this comes right before the very important meeting between President Putin, President Rouhani, and President Erdogan. And of course, in the coming days, I think after the meeting, there will probably be a military offensive against Al-Qaeda and their affiliates and their allies in Idlib, because despite the fact that the United States continues to support them and Western countries continue to support the extremists, and we believe that the United States will allow the extremists to carry out a false flag chemical attack operation and blame it on the Syrian government so the Americans and their allies, the French and the British, can strike Syria.
Ms. He, the other three parties that are directly involved in this discussion are likely already expressed their basic views. This is going to be another round of these three countries sitting together. Earlier rounds did not bear any fruits. So listening to these gentlemen's quite great analysis, I would say, and also fair analysis from their own perspectives, how do you see the potential of this meeting at all?
I would say this time, this meeting has something new. Comparing with all those previous ones, because now, given the big background, one is Turkey now is facing pressure very strongly from the U.S. So it seems in Erdogan's hand.
That's one thing. What about the other factors?
Yeah, in Erdogan's hand, there's no more those bargaining chips. Now he could negotiate with Putin. Another point is, I think now the Russia and Iran, now they will join hands, the three countries, they will support Syria to make this final offensive to these Idlibs, because this is going to be the final one, and they are going to make a victory over this. So this is going to be the final conclusion, I think, made by these three countries. Yeah.
Well, that's supposed to be the plan, but of course the United States, Mr. Slobodka, has also said very clearly about the possible actions coming from the three countries toward the province of Idlib, warned against the possible military attack in that province by the Syrian government because it is so-called the last stronghold, and there's likely to be bombardment according to the Syrian side. So what if the United States react, and to what degree do you think Washington could react?
Yeah, recently, in the last week, in the pages of the Washington Post, in an article by David Ignatius spoke to the usual anonymous U.S. regime administration official who said the U.S.'s job in Syria now is to create as many quagmires as they can until we get what they want. And that means specifically regime change by political rather than by proxy jihadist means. And that is what the U.S. is up to in Syria right now. The claims of suddenly having humanitarian concerns about Idlib, which has long been occupied by Al-Qaeda and dominated all the other groups in that area, as any expert in the field will tell you. is completely hypocritical and a little bit absurd. So this is just the U.S. Trying to prolong the conflict and bleed the Syrian government as much and Russia as much as possible, while they attempt to cement their control, their military occupation of East Syria.
We do not have an American guest at this time to respond to some of the accusations, Mr. Sloboda, you made earlier, but I'm sure there will be other occasions. Mr. Admir, though, I would like to go to you. The other two guests have expressed their clear opinions about what might be the result of this round of discussion, and as a result, the joint actions by the three sides. But Mr. Admir, since Turkey is quite new in this partnership, do you expect the same result?
Now, I think Idlib could turn out to be a long and messy campaign. As we have seen with two Turkish incursions into northern Syria, this is a difficult terrain. There are multiple groups changing alliances, and often military action results in high human costs, high civilian costs. So the future of Idlib is also, to some extent, I think, remains in the dark. But at the same time, I think we should consider the fact that of the three partners, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, Turkey has a set of different priorities than all the other players in the region. Turkey's first and foremost concern in Syria happens to be Syrian Kurds, happens to be the what Turkey considers as a terrorist group, the Syrian Kurdish YPG force. So although all other actors are looking this as a fight against jihadism, Turkey first and foremost looks to the future as to what the new power configuration could bring vis-a-vis Syrian Kurds, because Ankara sees Syrian Kurds, especially the YPG, as an existential threat, has repeatedly expressed this concern to even its NATO ally US, and has chosen to be on a crash course even with Washington on this issue.
Professor Morandi, so when we are talking about this discussion, it seems to be that next week there's going to be another round of discussion led by the UN with the participation of Russia, of Iran, of Turkey, and also the United States, Saudi Arabia, several other players as well, about the constitutional related issues. But of course, any of these discussions would eventually come back to this peace and stability in Syria and the legitimacy of the government in Syria. So, Professor Morandi, how do you see these two rounds of discussion likely to interact with one another? Which one is the real one?
I think the Astana process is definitely the key process. The other negotiations, the Geneva process, is something that the United States has been using all along to try to delegitimize the Syrian government and to undermine the Syrian government. And of course, Saudi Arabia is the country that more than any other country on this planet has been supporting Wahhabism and the jihadist groups, the different types of jihadist groups that we see in Syria. So I don't think that the Iranians or the Russians or Turkey, any of them have any illusions about the role that Saudi Arabia is playing. We know that, for example, Turkey and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates now also have very poor relations. So therefore, I think that the main priority right now is to get rid of the terrorist organizations in the province of Idlib, but it should be done in a way in which there's not a mass movement of people to Turkey, because that would be a huge burden on the country. So I think if the three countries can come together and find a solution where the Turks help the Iranians and the Russians and the Syrian government deal with this issue, that would be ideal.
Professor He, which discussion is the real discussion? Which discussion likely to really lead to results?
I think which one is the real fully depends on which one is in charge. because now it seems very clear that President Putin now is in charge. He's sitting in the driving seat. So that's actually make this Turkey and Russia and Iran, this mechanism more effective. And also this time around, this summit itself, because the Turkey now seems no much room to moving around. So they have to give some negotiation, those give up to Russians' demand. So I think eventually we will see, even though different players, they have their own agenda in their own pocket, but eventually they have to reach something in common.
I see. Before we go, I want to do a mini survey among the four of you. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have the four of you once again on the screen so that our audience could see whether this round of discussion among the three parties likely to bear any concrete result. Of course, a lot of words up to interpretation, but if you say yes, raise your hand. If you say no, just don't do that. Go ahead. Yes? All right. He Wenping, Mohammed Marandi, Icon Erdmik, and also Mark Sloboda. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. To mark the 5th anniversary of China's Belt and Road Initiative, special guests from around the world explain how this global initiative contributes to reshaping their prospects. Still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. In 5 years, the Belt and Road Initiative has linked China with many nations, near and far, and laid the foundation for much to come. I talked to a few leaders from some of the participating countries. Before diving into our conversations, let's take a look at the progress the initiative has made. A healthy dose of skepticism is always important. However, the capacity of commitment is definitely the key to make any vision come true. That is also true for the Belt and Road Initiative, also known as the BRI. Since 2013, the development strategy focusing on cross-border connectivity and cooperation has battled waves of doubt and skepticism about China's ambition and motives. Is it new colonialism? Is there money for it? Is it sustainable? Is it environmentally friendly? Now, all of those questions are important for clarity to prevail. However, I would argue one could only stay stuck if they were so overwhelmed with questions that they forget about preparation, action, and progress. Therefore, asking those questions alone does not help much. What is needed is to proactively take advantage of the BRI, which has been welcomed by governments around the world, and solve some of the biggest problems we face today. For example, when the vision of globalization is being threatened now by unilateralism, what should we do? Well, the BRI, which places emphasis on connectivity and cooperation regionally and globally, could be a cause to renew enthusiasm about globalization while trying to deal with some of its most difficult side effects. How to make sure everybody could win? It could be a confidence boost for globalization, an elevated version of globalization 2.0. Of course, no one is saying the BRI will be the solution to every problem we have these days, but it could definitely be a solution. Secondly, the extensive scale and diversity of BRI projects have shown that the initiative is inclusive, even though at the start of its implementation, Chinese development banks were mainly providing funds. But as time goes by, the BRI could serve as a lodestar, leading major corporates, public sectors, and financial institutions into cooperation. The oil pipeline in Myanmar and rail network in Asia, for example, are believed to be necessary and successful projects. Financial institutions and other players could, as a result, become much more active. Thirdly, the Chinese economy is experiencing challenges of its own now. Its growth rate is slowing down in the process of looking for the best ways to go about structural reform. Its external challenges are also increasing, such as the impact of the trade conflict with the United States. At the same time, the country is looking for new ways to reform and open up. there's no magic remedy to cure all the symptoms and deal with all the root causes at once. But, as the Chinese experience suggests, only through development can new momentum and solutions emerge and spread. The BRI could be a big possibility to bring about possible solutions as its projects move forward. As we mentioned earlier, skepticism helps us adjust, but it is actions and real plans that get us where we really want to be. Last but not least, when the remaining of the Chinese population comes out of poverty, an unprecedented market will be presented to the world. That has been the key to growth worldwide. When the BRI brings countries together through connectivity and cooperation, poverty will be tackled during the process, and the real world market will emerge. Remember very clearly, last conversation we had was during the Belt and Road Forum being held in Beijing as well. You know, it's only 5 years, the BRI, from the time it was initiated to the time now it is being gradually implementing. But Mr. Secretary General, to you, what are some of the most important takeaways for the past 5 years, particularly if you think about cooperation between China and Africa?
No, I think the most important is exactly this capacity to look into each project not as something that is isolated, but into everything integrated in the Sustainable Development Goals, everything integrated in the Agenda 2030, everything integrated in the African Agenda 2063, 100 years after the first independence,
yes.
And to make sure that all this is combined and all converge with the same purposes. And obviously, when a new initiative comes, there is an effort that is needed to make sure that this initiative fully fits into this global approach, and that is the role that the United Nations can help to provide. To make sure that there is coherence and convergence of all these initiatives. And of course, the increase of the Chinese role in international cooperation is a very important tool for development cooperation to be more and more supportive of the developing countries to be able to reach the objectives and the targets that were defined by the whole of the international community, by the summit of all heads of state in the Agenda 2030.
Mr. President, I understand Belt and Road Initiative, for example, is one of the initiatives that China and South Africa are working on together.
Yes.
Particularly, South Africa is an important nation among the maritime Silk Road. Mr. President, how do you see this idea, first of all? I mean, it's only 5 years in the making, right?
Yes.
Since the very beginning of being raised up, that initiative, to now, where is it according to your assessment?
Well, the Belt and Road Initiative is an important one, not only for China, but also for South Africa, because we see that as strengthening the relationship between the two countries. But it is also based on a number of important pillars, and the pillars of the various agreements that we've got with China around a number of other areas of infrastructure build, of investment, of trade, and the Belt and Road initiative then comes on top of all this and cements and strengthens all these relationships. And with that, we also want to see implementation, because we just don't want to end up at making announcements. We want to see how the undertakings, the agreements are implemented.
BRI Forum successfully concluded. At the end of the day, what do you make of the role between the IMF and this mechanism of Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, first of all, the Belt and Road Initiative is, in my view, a very positive proposal by China. And it is positive from a growth perspective. We have always advocated infrastructure projects around the world, both hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure as well, in order to support growth in the short term, but also to improve the terms in the longer perspective. And that's exactly what it is doing. But it is doing it in a very special way, which is a coordinated way. That's where the IMF can play a role. We can help the coordination of policies between the various members of the Belt and Road Initiative. And we can also provide technical assistance. As part of the BRI project, we have signed an agreement with the Chinese authorities, and we're going to dedicate capacity development expertise that we have in Beijing for those who will need special technical assistance, special training, in order to put in place efficient infrastructure projects, in order to coordinate at all levels. And from those two perspectives, policy coordination, capacity building, we can really provide the decades of expertise that we have in these fields.
Madam Lagarde, there have been different debates about what is the nature of BRI. Is it globalization 2.0, as China said? Or is it part of a new globalization, as you beautifully mentioned several times internationally? Or is it China's geopolitical ambition involved? What exactly is it from your perspective?
For the project to be successful, it has to be mutually beneficial for all the participants. It's the virtue of the network, of the connections, of the interrelationships and the linkages that will be established that will actually deliver the added value to each and every project, to each and every country. It's a bit like, you know, some of the inventions of the past, the telephones, or anything that is based on network and connections. If you only have a small number of connected beneficials, it's going to remain a small project. If everybody is connected, if everybody benefits, then it's going to be a successful venture. So I think that it's difficult to articulate a single purpose, because each and every participant will see benefits to it. But that's the key, that everybody can benefit from it, and that there is this sort of joint approach to mutually beneficial outcome at all countries' levels, which is why policy coordination and governance will matter in the long run.
Even though a lot of people talk about there have been dramatic changes going on in the world, but not many actions, not many implementable initiatives have been raised up as a result of that. So as the head of the IMF, Madame Lagarde, I do want you to help us understand, where can we go from here?
You know, one of the most critical objectives is inclusion. Make sure that poverty is eradicated as much as possible. Low income have a chance to get higher. And to do that, it's much easier when you have growth. That's number one. The Belt and Road Initiative should certainly stimulate growth. Number two, once that growth is sustainable and stronger, then you need to invest in those propositions and projects that will help people. Better education, better training, better adjustment to that new society, which will be much more fueled by technologies, by new devices. And number three, appropriate redistribution policies in order to make sure that there is a proper sharing and there is a proper burden sharing by people, because it is otherwise that sense of being excluded, being deprived, the system being unfair, that leads to rejection of the entire system, which can otherwise be very beneficial.
AIIB is working ever closely with China, for example, on some of the Belt and Road Initiative projects. Does that mean that you are getting this nature about China's contribution ever clearer than all the other natures that the AIIB is supposed to shoulder?
Talking about Belt and Road Initiative, I think it's interesting for me to share with you some of our perspectives on this issue. Some people confused Belt Road Initiative with AIIB, and I've tried my very best to clarify.
And this will be a good occasion to do that.
But you see, some people asked the question, why did the World Bank, ADB, EBRD, and the New Development Bank, which is headquartered in Shanghai,
that's right,
and
with the BRICS,
AIIB entered into agreement with the Chinese Ministry of Finance about supporting the Belt and Road Initiative? And so my answer is, first of all, don't look at the initiator. Look at the initiative itself. Is this a good one? If it's good, we should all support it. This kind of very, very good initiative. As you see, World Bank and other institutions have always responded to the initiatives of the major shareholders, G20, APAC. It's all right.
You mentioned a lot about infrastructure throughout our conversation, Mr. Minister. Yes. As you may know, this year also 5th anniversary already of the Belt and Road Initiative, otherwise known as the BRI. It's supposed to be a platform and an initiative to make countries and all kinds of players to come together about connectivity, about cooperation on infrastructure. So the question is, how much opportunity does Italy see in this initiative?
We think in Italy that the Belt and Road Initiative is a real great project. It's a very comprehensive strategies for collaboration between countries. Then Italy is strongly interested in participating in this big project, both along the land route connecting Asia and Europe, and along also the maritime route connecting through the sea, Asia, China and Europe. And of course we think that Italy, for historical point of view, but also looking at the modern time and the future, can be the natural terminal of the maritime route of the Belt and Road Initiative. And then we can have a partnership in order to operate in third countries, or in China, or in Italy. But we understood that this project is a project that is not limited to the economic issues, but it's a big project that is important to increase the collaboration between the countries involved, and in this way it's possible also to govern the big change in the economic, in the global, the big change in the global economy in a collaborative way.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Inside CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Inside team, thanks for watching, and have a great weekend.